Hey guys, tonight we are standing on a dusty, sun-baked plain. The air is thick, not with heat, but with a kind of heavy moral humidity. All around you, the sounds of life are jarring, chaotic, laughter that has a cruel edge, music that feels more like a threat than a celebration, and the constant, grinding noise of a world that has forgotten the meaning of quiet, of peace. You look up at the sky, but it seems distant, brassy, and indifferent. Now imagine being told that all of this, every single person, every building, every single loud, angry, beautiful, terrible thing is about to be washed away. And you're the one holding the umbrella. Let's be honest, in that scenario, you probably won't survive this. Not without a truly epic amount of gopher wood and a level of faith that's frankly off the charts. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. It's always lovely to know who's listening along with me, so feel free to post your location and what time it is where you are. It's a wonderful way for us to feel connected in this quiet moment. The world wasn't born broken, but it had learned how to be. It's a strange thing to think about, a world without ruins, a world where every mountain was in its original place, and every river flowed in the channel it was first given. But the landscape of the human heart, that was another story entirely. It had become a maze of shadowed valleys and treacherous cliffs. The story of the Great Flood doesn't begin with a single drop of rain. It begins with a slow, creeping saturation of the soul. In the days before the ark, the earth was full, not just full of people, but full to the brim with a loud, clangorous, and unrelenting energy. The Bible describes it with a chilling simplicity. The earth was corrupt in God's sight, and it was full of violence. Let's try to imagine what that really felt like. It wasn't just a matter of crime rates or political instability. It was in the air you breathed. It was a world where might was the only right. Imagine a conversation where the strongest voice, not the truest, was the one that was heard. Imagine a marketplace where a deal was only good for as long as you were strong enough to enforce it. Imagine homes where kindness was seen as a vulnerability, a weakness to be exploited. The violence wasn't just on battlefields. It was in the home, in the market, at the town well. It was a constant, grinding friction between people, a world where everyone was looking out for themselves, climbing over the backs of others to get a little higher, a little more secure. And in a world like that, nobody is ever truly secure. The laughter was a little too loud, a little too sharp, often at someone else's expense. The music had a frantic, desperate rhythm, as if trying to drown out a deep, unspoken fear. And God, looking down, saw not just the actions but the source. Every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. It's a devastating line, not just some evil or occasional evil, only evil, continually. A feedback loop of selfishness and cruelty that was poisoning creation from the inside out. And into this world, the scripture introduces a strange and fascinating detail, a story that feels like a fragment of a much older, wilder mythology. It speaks of the sons of God who saw the daughters of man, that they were beautiful, and they took wives for themselves, whomever they chose. Who were these sons of God? Angels, fallen angels, a line of righteous kings who began to intermarry with those who had turned from God. The text is ancient and mysterious, and it doesn't give us easy answers. But the result of these unions was a people known as the Nephilim, the heroes of old, men of renown. The word itself can be translated as the fallen ones. These weren't just strong men, they were giants, figures of immense power, and one can imagine immense appetites. Their presence on the earth seemed to amplify the violence, to codify it. They were the ultimate expression of might makes right. Their fame, their renown, was likely built on conquest and domination. They were the celebrities, the influencers of their day, and the culture they modeled was one of pride, power, and utter disregard for the gentle and the meek. This was the world that grieved God to his heart. It's one of the most painfully human descriptions of God in the entire Old Testament. Not just anger, not just disappointment, but a deep, profound sorrow. The feeling a master artist might have, watching their most beautiful, intricate, and beloved creation deliberately tear itself to pieces. He saw his world, which he had called very good, gasping for air under the weight of its own wickedness. And so, with the heavy heart of a creator who loved what he had made, he came to a terrible conclusion. A conclusion that sounds like a judgment, but is spoken with the sadness of a final resort. I will blot out man whom I have created from the face of the land, man and animals, and creeping things and birds of the heavens, for I am sorry that I have made them. The cure would have to be as radical as the disease. The world needed to be washed clean. But in every great story of judgment, God always seems to leave a door open for grace, a crack of light in the overwhelming dark. And that light in this story was a man. But Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. What an extraordinary sentence. In a world of perpetual evil, in a world of violent giants and corrupt hearts, one man found favor. The text tells us why. Noah was a righteous man, blameless in his generation. Noah walked with God. Let's take a moment with that. He wasn't blameless in a vacuum. He was blameless in his generation. Amidst all that noise, he cultivated a quiet heart. Amidst all that violence, he practiced peace. Amidst all that selfishness, he walked with God. Walking with God implies a relationship, a conversation. It's not just a weekly appointment, it's a daily journey. It means your steps are trying to match his. Your direction is aligned with his. In a world where everyone was marching to the frantic beat of their own drum, Noah was listening to a different rhythm. He was probably considered a very strange man. Quiet, perhaps. A little out of step with the times. His neighbors were likely building bigger barns, sharper weapons, higher walls. Noah was building a family, a character, a relationship with the unseen. He and his wife raised 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and they must have taught them this different way of living, a way that valued integrity over power and faith over fleeting success. In the context of his world, Noah's simple, righteous life was a louder protest than any shouted sermon. It was a living, breathing testament to the fact that there was another way. He was, in a sense, a living fossil, a remnant of a time when humanity remembered its creator. And because of that, he was about to be given the most bizarre, the most demanding, and the most world-altering construction project in human history. One can only imagine the day that the voice of God broke through the ordinary rhythm of Noah's life with an instruction that would have sounded like utter madness. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a blueprint. Make yourself an ark of gopher wood. And then came the details, a stream of divine engineering specs that must have left Noah reeling. The wood itself, gopher wood, is a mystery to us now. Some scholars think it was cypress, a wood known for its durability and water-resistant properties. But the name is unique, a word used only here, as if to signify a unique vessel for a unique purpose. Then the dimensions, 300 cubits long, 50 cubits wide, and 30 cubits high. Let's try to put that in perspective. A cubit was a common ancient measurement, roughly the length from a man's elbow to the tip of his middle finger, about 18 inches or half a meter. So, this vessel was to be roughly 450 feet long, 75 feet wide, and 45 feet high. It was longer than a modern football field. It had the same displacement as some of the great ocean liners of the early 20th century. This was not a boat. It was a floating building, a colossal rectangular barge designed not for speed or for steering, but for stability, for survival. It was to have 3 decks dividing the immense inner space, a roof, and a window, a single window, a cubit high, set near the top. Just one source of light for the entire vessel, and a door, a single large door in its side. Finally, the most practical of instructions: cover it inside and out with pitch, a thick, black, waterproof tar to seal every seam, every joint, against the unimaginable pressures of the water to come. The sheer audacity of the command is breathtaking. God was not asking Noah to build a shelter on high ground. He was asking him to become a shipbuilder in the middle of dry land, with no body of water in sight large enough to float such a monstrous creation. He was asking him to build a vessel for a type of rain that had never before been seen, to save him from a flood that would unmake the world. And then came the most chilling part of the instruction, the reason for all this. For behold, I will bring a flood of waters upon the earth to destroy all flesh in which is the breath of life under heaven. Everything that is on the earth shall die. But then the promise, but I will establish my covenant with you, and you shall come into the ark, you, your sons, your wife, and your sons' wives with you. And not just them. The ark was to become a floating zoo, a genetic repository for the future of all life, and of every living thing of all flesh. You shall bring 2 of every sort into the ark to keep them alive with you. They shall be male and female, from the birds to the cattle to the things that creep upon the ground. A pair of each was to come. And finally, the practical matter of catering. Noah was to gather and store every kind of food imaginable for his family and for this menagerie, enough to last for a very, very long time. The book of Genesis sums up Noah's response in a single, powerful verse. Noah did this. He did all that God commanded him. There's no record of him arguing, no record of him questioning his own sanity, no record of him asking for a second opinion or a smaller, more manageable project. He simply obeyed. This simple obedience is perhaps the most incredible part of the story. It speaks of a faith so deep, so practiced, that when the most unbelievable command was given, the only possible response was yes. And so the work began. This was not a project of weeks or months. Based on the ages of his sons and the timing of the flood, it's believed the construction of the ark took decades, possibly 50, 70, even 120 years. Imagine that. A lifetime devoted to a single, colossal task. The first step would have been the logging. Noah and his 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, would have become lumberjacks. Day after day, year after year, the rhythmic thud of axes against the trunks of ancient gopher trees, the tremendous crash as another giant fell to the earth. They would have had to learn the craft of forestry, of milling, of shaping the raw timber into usable planks and beams. Imagine the sheer volume of wood required. Acres and acres of forest felled by the hands of just 4 men. Then came the construction itself. A vast, open-air shipyard, miles from any sea. The slow, methodical laying of the foundation. The raising of the massive skeletal frame. The ribs of the ark reaching up to the sky like the bones of some gargantuan beast. The air would have been filled with the scent of fresh-cut wood and the sound of hammers, saws, and adzes. They would have worked through the changing seasons, the baking sun of summer, the cold winds of winter. Their hands would have become calloused and strong, their faces weathered by the sun and wind. This wasn't just a construction project. It was their entire life. Every morning, they would wake with the ark dominating the horizon, a constant, physical reminder of their strange and singular purpose. And as the years turned into decades, the ark slowly took shape, a bizarre landmark in the middle of the plains. And people would have noticed. You can't build something the size of the Titanic in your backyard without attracting a bit of attention. Travelers on their way to distant cities would have stopped and stared, shaking their heads in disbelief. Locals would have made it a regular source of amusement. Going to see Noah, folly, they might have called it. We can imagine the scenes. A group of merchants, leaning on their staffs, watching Noah and his sons hoisting another massive beam into place. What is the old man building? One might ask. A palace for the birds. Another would jeer, and they would all laugh. Children would have dared each other to run up and touch the strange wooden mountain before running away squealing with laughter. The self-proclaimed wise men of the local villages would have stroked their beards and declared Noah utterly insane. The man has lost his mind. He talks to a god no one can see and builds a ship where there is no water. He wastes his life on a fantasy. The taunts would have been relentless. Hey, Noah, expecting a little shower. Where are you going to sail that thing, Noah? On the morning dew. Don't forget your fishing pole, you old fool. Every day would have brought fresh ridicule. This, perhaps, was the greatest test of Noah's faith. It's one thing to obey God in the quiet of your own heart. It's another thing entirely to obey Him publicly, for decades, in the face of constant, unremitting mockery. He wasn't just a builder, he was, as the New Testament calls him, a preacher of righteousness. His sermon was not just words, it was the rhythmic pounding of his hammer. Every plank he fastened into place was a testament to his belief, a warning of the judgment he knew was coming. But nobody listened. They saw his work, they heard his warnings, and they chose to see it all as a grand joke. They were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, living their loud, violent, self-absorbed lives, completely oblivious to the storm gathering just over the horizon of their understanding. And what about Noah's family? His wife, whose name the Bible doesn't give us, but whose faith must have been as steadfast as her husband's. Imagine her perspective. Managing the household, preparing the food for her hardworking husband and sons, mending their clothes, and all the while enduring the whispers and stares of the other women at the well. Her 3 sons, who grew from boys into men in the shadow of the ark. They learned their father's faith along with his carpentry skills, and their wives, who married into this strange project, leaving their own families to join this small clan of believers, this lonely outpost of sanity in a world gone mad. They must have had their moments of doubt, their nights of fear. Lying in their beds, hearing the wind howl outside, did they ever wonder if their father-in-law was truly hearing from God? Did they ever wish for a normal life? But whatever their private struggles, they held fast. They worked alongside the men, perhaps preparing the pitch, weaving ropes, or managing the growing stockpiles of food. Their loyalty, their shared work, was the silent engine that kept the project moving forward. They were a family bound together, not just by blood, but by a shared, world-altering purpose. And then, after a lifetime of labor, the day came when the last plank was secured. The last seam was sealed with pitch. The ark was finished, a silent, colossal monument to one man's faith, sitting under a cloudless sky. And then, the next phase of the divine plan began. The miracle of the animals. This wasn't a frantic chase across the continent with nets and cages. The scripture says the animals came to Noah to go into the ark. It was an orderly, divinely compelled procession. Imagine Noah and his family standing at the great open door of the ark, watching the horizon. And then they appear. At first, a few specks in the distance, then more, a living river of creatures flowing towards them from every direction. 2 by 2, male and female. The great elephants, their footsteps like a slow drumbeat on the earth. The giraffes, their long necks swaying gracefully against the sky. Lions, walking peacefully beside the lambs they would normally have hunted. Bears, wolves, rhinos, hippos, the great beasts of the world, and the smaller ones too, the armadillos, the porcupines, the rabbits, and from the air the birds, eagles, doves, parrots, sparrows, in a great, colorful cloud. And the creeping things, the lizards and turtles and insects, a complete cross-section of terrestrial life. Of the clean animals, the ones suitable for sacrifice and food, they came in sevens. The logistics are mind-boggling, but the story presents it as a miracle, not a puzzle. It was God's project, and He was handling the invitations. The sounds would have been incredible. The air, once filled with the sounds of human violence, was now filled with the cries, roars, and calls of the animal kingdom. Noah and his sons would have guided them in, through the great door, and into the stalls and pens they had prepared. The 3 decks of the ark would have slowly filled up, becoming a living library of God's creation. How did they all fit? How were they all fed? The story doesn't concern itself with these questions. It focuses on the sheer wonder of the event. For a brief time, the peace of Eden was restored, as predator and prey walked together into the wooden sanctuary that would save them from the coming storm. Finally, the last creature was aboard. The last sack of grain was stored. Noah and his family, 8 people in total, walked up the great ramp one last time, leaving the world of humanity behind. They stood in the doorway, looking out at the world they had known, the world that had mocked them for so long. And then, a moment of profound and terrifying finality. And the Lord shut him in. The door wasn't pulled shut by Noah. It was sealed from the outside by a divine hand. The last connection to the old world was severed. The decision was final. The time for repentance was over. For 7 days, they waited. 7 days in the dim, lantern-lit interior of the ark, surrounded by the shuffling, breathing, living presence of the entire animal kingdom. What must that week have been like? The calm before the storm. The final, silent countdown. Outside, the world went on as it always had. The sun rose and set. People laughed, worked, and argued, perhaps pointing at the silent, sealed vessel and making their final jokes. They had no idea that they were living on borrowed time, that the clock of their world had all but run out. And then, on the 17th day of the 2nd month, in the 600th year of Noah's life, it began. It did not start with a gentle pitter-patter. The Bible uses language of cosmic violence. On that day, all the fountains of the great deep burst forth, and the windows of heaven were opened. This was not just rain. It was a decreation. The waters that God had separated on the 2nd day of creation, the waters below the earth and the waters above the sky, were now being reunited. From below, the ground itself must have split open, great geysers of subterranean water erupting with unimaginable force. And from above, it wasn't rain as we know it. The windows of heaven opening suggests a deluge, a solid wall of water pouring down from the sky. The sound would have been deafening. A constant, roaring, hissing cataclysm that drowned out every other sound in the world. For the people outside the ark, the first moments must have been ones of confusion, then of panic. The water rose with terrifying speed. It would have filled the valleys, then the plains. People would have scrambled for high ground, their mockery turning to screams of terror. But there was no high ground high enough. The water kept rising, relentless, merciless. It covered the hills, and then the mountains. Every human achievement, every city, every tower, every monument to their own pride was submerged and swept away. Inside the ark, 8 survivors would have felt a great lurching motion. The massive vessel, which had sat immobile on the dry ground for so long, was now buoyant. It was lifting, rising with the water. They were afloat. For 40 days and 40 nights, the downpour continued without pause. The world outside their wooden walls was reduced to a formless, chaotic sea. They were utterly alone, a tiny speck of life in an ocean of death, tossed on the waves of a world being reborn. Life on the ark settled into a new, strange routine. Their world was now defined by the 3 decks, the dim light from the single window near the roof, and the rhythm of their chores. Morning would have been a cacophony of animal sounds, a global alarm clock demanding to be fed. The work would have been immense, a constant cycle of distributing food and water and mucking out the stalls. It was hard, smelly, exhausting work. They were not on a luxury cruise. They were the caretakers of the future. The air would have been thick with the smells of animals, hay, and damp wood. The only sounds from the outside world were the constant drumming of the rain on the roof and the groan of the massive timbers as the ark was tossed by the waves. They would have had to rely on each other completely. The 8 of them, floating in a wooden box on an endless sea. They would have prayed together, eaten together, and perhaps told stories of the world that was, to remember why they were here. Did they feel fear? Almost certainly. The awesome, terrifying power of the flood outside would have been a constant reminder of God's judgment. Did they feel grief? How could they not? Every person they had ever known, apart from each other, was gone. Their entire world had vanished beneath the waves. But they also must have felt a profound sense of purpose and an overwhelming gratitude. They were the ones who had found grace. They were the seed of the new world. For 150 days, the waters prevailed upon the earth. The rain had stopped after 40 days, but the world remained submerged. Every mountain peak was covered. The ark drifted aimlessly on the surface of the global ocean. Then, the Bible says, God remembered Noah. It's a beautiful phrase. It doesn't mean God had forgotten. It means he was now turning his attention to the next stage of his plan. He sent a wind to blow over the earth, and the waters began to recede. The fountains of the deep and the windows of heaven were closed. The judgment was over. The process of healing had begun. Slowly, day by day, the water level dropped. After months of drifting, they felt a new sensation. A jolt, a scraping, grinding halt. The ark had come to rest. It had landed on the mountains of Ararat. They were on solid ground again, even if that ground was the peak of a high mountain. But still, they waited. The view from their high window would have slowly changed. First, just water. Then, after many more weeks, the tops of the highest mountains began to appear, like small islands in a vast sea. Noah, needing to know if the earth was ready, devised a plan. He opened the window and sent out a raven. The hardy scavenger bird flew back and forth, able to survive on the carrion that would have been floating on the water until the earth was drier. It didn't give him the information he needed, so he waited, and then he sent out a dove. The dove, a bird that needs dry land to rest and find its food, was a more delicate and precise instrument. The first time, she flew out and found no place to rest her foot, and she returned to the ark. Noah reached out his hand and brought her back inside. He knew the world was not yet ready. He waited 7 more days. The patience of this man is astounding. After almost a year on the ark, he waited another week. He sent the dove out again. This time, she returned in the evening, and in her beak was a freshly plucked olive leaf. It was the first sign of new life, a message from the reborn world. The flood had not sterilized the earth. Life was returning. That small green leaf was a symbol of immense hope, a promise of peace between God and the earth. It was proof that their long ordeal was nearing its end. Noah waited another 7 days. He sent the dove out a 3rd time, and this time she did not return. She had found a home. The earth was habitable again. At last, more than a full year after they had first entered the ark, the command came from God. Go out of the ark, you and your wife, and your sons and your sons' wives with you. Bring out with you every living thing that is with you, that they may swarm on the earth, and be fruitful and multiply on the earth. With great effort, they unsealed the massive door. The light that flooded in must have been blinding. The air that rushed in was cool, clean, and fresh. It was the smell of a brand new world. They stepped out, one by one, onto the damp earth of the mountainside. The world was utterly transformed. It was silent. The loud, violent, chaotic noise of the old world was gone. All that remained was the sound of the wind and the call of the birds they were releasing. The landscape was washed clean, barren, but full of potential. As the animals bounded, flew, and crept out of the ark, spreading out across the new world to fulfill their purpose, Noah did something remarkable. Before building a house, before planting a field, before doing anything for himself, he built an altar. He took some of the clean animals and birds, and he offered a sacrifice to the Lord. It was an act of pure worship, of profound gratitude for their deliverance, and the Lord smelled the pleasing aroma. It was the smell of a thankful heart, the first sweet scent to rise from the new earth. And God made a promise, a covenant, not just with Noah, but with all of creation for all time. I will never again curse the ground because of man, for the intention of man's heart is evil from his youth. Neither will I ever again strike down every living creature as I have done. While the earth remains, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night, shall not cease. The fundamental rhythms of the world would be preserved. There would be no cosmic reset button again. And he gave them a sign, a beautiful, visible reminder of this promise. I have set my bow in the cloud, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and the earth when the bow is in the clouds. I will see it and remember the everlasting covenant. The rainbow, a warrior's bow hung up in the sky, its string facing away from the earth, a symbol of peace, no longer an instrument of judgment, but a breathtakingly beautiful promise that whatever storms may come, whatever floods may rise, God's grace would hold and the world would endure. The story that began with the grieving heart of God and the cleansing waters of judgment ends with a promise of peace. painted in brilliant color across the sky for all of us to see. The world after the flood was a quiet place, a clean slate. The rainbow that arched across the sky was a constant, shimmering reminder of God's promise. Never again would the waters cover the whole earth. Humanity, through Noah's family, was given a second chance, a fresh start on a washed and waiting world. But a clean landscape doesn't automatically create clean hearts. The seeds of the old world's problems, pride, selfishness, the desire to make a name for oneself, were carried within the human spirit, like dormant spores, waiting for the right conditions to grow. And grow they did. Not many generations passed before we see humanity gathering on a plain called Shinar, filled with a familiar, restless ambition. They had learned a new technology, how to bake bricks and use bitumen for mortar. And with it, they decided to build a city and a tower, a ziggurat whose top would reach the heavens. "Let us make a name for ourselves," they said, "lest we be dispersed over the face of the whole earth." It was a direct challenge to God's command to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. They sought unity through human ambition and security through human engineering, rather than through a relationship with their Creator. And God's response was not a cataclysm of fire or flood, but something far more subtle and, in its own way, just as powerful. He came down and confused their language, unraveling the single thread of their communication. The great project ground to a halt, not with a crash, but with a murmur of misunderstanding. The builders could no longer coordinate their efforts. A request for a brick was met with a delivery of mortar. An instruction to lift was met with a gesture to lower. Frustration turned to suspicion, and cooperation dissolved into chaos. From this place, called Babel, meaning confusion, the people were finally scattered across the face of the earth, just as God had intended. The world was filled, not by a unified, prideful empire, but by a mosaic of different peoples and different tongues. It's in this scattered world that God changes his strategy. Instead of dealing with humanity as a whole, he calls one man, a man named Abram, from the city of Ur, a city that itself had a great ziggurat temple. God calls him out of that world of man-made towers and institutionalized religion, and gives him a simple, staggering command. Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. And with the command came a promise that would echo down through the rest of the biblical story. And I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. Abram, whose name would be changed to Abraham, becomes the father of a new kind of people, a people defined not by their location or their language, but by their faith in the promises of God. Abraham's story is one of wandering, of waiting, of faith tested and proven. And it's in the context of his life that we encounter our next great disaster. A disaster that isn't global, but intensely local. A story not of water, but of fire. It unfolds in the plains of the Jordan Valley, in two cities whose names have become bywords for wickedness, Sodom and Gomorrah. Story begins not with sin, but with a choice. Years earlier, Abraham and his nephew Lot had found that the land could not support both of their massive flocks and herds. To keep peace in the family, Abraham, in a gesture of great generosity, gave his younger nephew the first choice of the land. And Lot looked up, and he saw the Jordan Valley. The Bible says it was well watered everywhere, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt. It was prime real estate, green, lush, and prosperous. And so Lot chose the plain and pitched his tents near the city of Sodom. It was a practical choice, a business decision. But the scripture adds a chilling note. Now the men of Sodom were wicked, great sinners against the Lord. Lot chose the best land, but he settled his family on the doorstep of the worst of humanity. Years pass. Lot moves from his tents into the city itself, becoming one of its leading citizens, sitting at the city gate where business and legal matters were decided. And all the while, the wickedness of Sodom and its sister cities grew. It wasn't just one kind of sin, but a deep, systemic corruption. The prophets, looking back on Sodom, describe it as a place of arrogance, of gluttony, of prosperous ease, and most damningly, of a complete failure to help the poor and needy. It was a culture of extreme selfishness, where those with power and resources used them only for their own pleasure. And it seems to have been a place of profound cruelty, where strangers were not welcomed, but seen as objects for exploitation and violence. The sacred, ancient duty of hospitality, a cornerstone of civilization in the ancient Near East, was utterly perverted. The outcry against the city grew so great that it reached heaven. An outcry is the sound of the oppressed, the cry of victims. The very land seemed to be groaning under the weight of Sodom's sin. Our story picks up on a hot afternoon as Abraham is sitting at the entrance to his tent by the great oaks of Mamre. He looks up and sees 3 men standing nearby. Without a moment's hesitation, Abraham springs into action. He runs to meet them, bows low to the ground, and insists they stop and rest. He offers water to wash their feet, a place to rest in the shade, and a morsel of bread. But he provides a feast. He rushes to his wife, Sarah, telling her to quickly bake cakes from the finest flour. He runs to the herd and chooses a tender, prime calf and has it prepared. He brings out curds and milk. He serves them himself, standing by them under the tree as they eat. This is the absolute pinnacle of ancient hospitality. It is generous, immediate, humble, and personal. It is the polar opposite of the spirit of Sodom, and it becomes clear these are no ordinary travelers. One of them is the Lord himself, and the other 2 are angels in human form. They reaffirm the promise that Sarah, well past the age of childbearing, will have a son. And then, as the visitors get up to leave, their faces turn towards Sodom. Abraham walks with them, and the Lord decides to confide in him, his friend, because the outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is great, and their sin is very grave. He says, "I will go down to see if they have done altogether according to the outcry that has come to me." It is a divine investigation. What follows is one of the most remarkable conversations in the entire Bible. As the two angels walk on ahead towards the city, Abraham remains standing before the Lord, and he draws near, his heart filled with a terrible anxiety for the people of the city and for his nephew, Lot. He asks a question that cuts to the very heart of the nature of justice. Will you indeed sweep away the righteous with the wicked? It is a bold, almost audacious question to ask of God. Abraham isn't questioning God's power. He's appealing to his character, to his righteousness. Far be it from you to do such a thing. Shall not the judge of all the earth do what is just? And so begins an extraordinary negotiation. Abraham, the humble servant, bargains with the Creator of the universe. Suppose there are 50 righteous within the city. Will you then sweep away the place and not spare it for the 50 righteous who are in it? And the Lord, full of patience and grace, agrees. If I find at Sodom 50 righteous in the city, I will spare the whole place for their sake. But Abraham is not done. He knows Sodom. 50 seems like a high number. He presses on with great humility. Behold, I have undertaken to speak to the Lord, I who am but dust and ashes. Suppose 5 of the 50 righteous are lacking. Will you destroy the whole city for lack of 5? I will not destroy it if I find 45 there. He speaks again. Suppose 40 are found there. For the sake of 40, I will not do it. The number keeps dropping. 30, 20. Abraham is pushing the limits of his position, but he is driven by a desperate hope. Finally, he makes his last plea. Oh, let not the Lord be angry, and I will speak again, but this once. Suppose 10 are found there, 10 righteous people, in 2 whole cities, a tiny remnant, and the Lord makes his final concession. For the sake of 10, I will not destroy it. And when the Lord finished speaking with Abraham, he went his way, and Abraham returned to his tent. The bargain was struck. The fate of the cities now rested on the presence of just 10 good people. The scene shifts. The 2 angels arrive at the gate of Sodom in the evening, and there, sitting at the gate, is Lot. Just as his uncle Abraham had done, Lot sees the strangers and immediately recognizes his duty. He rises, bows his face to the ground, and insists that they come to his house to spend the night. Turn aside, my lords, to your servant's house, and spend the night, and wash your feet. Then you may rise up early and go on your way. At first, they refuse, saying they will spend the night in the town square. But this horrifies Lot. He knows the dangers of the city after dark. He knows that strangers in the open are not safe. He pressed them strongly, the text says, and finally they relent and go with him to his home. Like Abraham, he prepares a feast for them and bakes unleavened bread. In this one house, the ancient laws of hospitality are still honored. But before they lay down to sleep, the hospitality of Lot's house is besieged by the horror of the city. The house is surrounded, not by a small gang of thugs, but by the men of the city, both young and old, all the people to the last man. It is the entire male population, united in a single, monstrous purpose. They pound on the door, their voices a vicious chorus. "Where are the men who came to you tonight?" they shout to Lot. "Bring them out to us, that we may know them." The word "know" here is a clear euphemism for a brutal, violent, sexual assault. They want to humiliate and dominate these strangers, to violate them in the most profound way possible. This is the sin of Sodom in its rawest form. A violent, predatory inhospitality that seeks to destroy the vulnerable for its own perverse pleasure. Lot, trapped and desperate, goes out to them, shutting the door behind him to protect his guests. He pleads with them, "I beg you, my brothers, do not act so wickedly." In his panic, he makes a terrible, horrifying offer, one that shows just how distorted the culture has become. He offers his own 2 virgin daughters to the mob instead. "Let me bring them out to you," he says, "and do to them as you please. Only do nothing to these men, for they have come under the shelter of my roof." It's a shocking moment, but the mob is not interested. They see Lot as an outsider, a sojourner, and they are enraged that he is presuming to judge them. "Now we will deal worse with you than with them," they cry, and they surge forward to break down the door. At that moment, the heavenly nature of the guests is revealed. The 2 angels reach out, pull Lot back into the house, and shut the door. And then they strike the mob outside with a sudden, supernatural blindness. The men are left groping for the doorway, their vicious energy dissolving into confused frustration. The immediate threat is neutralized. Inside, the angels get straight to the point. Their investigation is complete. "Have you anyone else here?" they ask Lot. "Sons-in-law, sons, daughters, or anyone else in the city who belongs to you? Bring them out of the place, for we are about to destroy this place, because the outcry against it has become great before the Lord, and the Lord has sent us to destroy it." Lot rushes out into the night to find the men who were engaged to his daughters. He gives them the urgent warning, "Up, get out of this place, for the Lord is about to destroy the city." But they don't believe him. The text says he seemed to be jesting. The idea is so preposterous, so outside their realm of experience, that they just laugh at him. Their hearts are so much a part of the city that they cannot conceive of its end. As the dawn begins to break, the angel's urgency turns to action. "Up," they say to Lot. "Take your wife and your 2 daughters who are here, lest you be swept away in the punishment of the city." But Lot hesitated. Think of it. His home was there, his possessions, his social standing. His entire life was interwoven with the fabric of Sodom. To leave meant abandoning everything. His hesitation is so human, so understandable, and so dangerous. Seeing this, the angels take him by the hand, and his wife by the hand, and his 2 daughters by the hand, and they physically drag them out of the city. The Lord being merciful to him, the scripture adds. He is saved, not by his own decisiveness, but by God's grace pulling him to safety against his own inertia. Once outside the city walls, the command is stark and absolute. Escape for your life. Do not look back or stop anywhere in the valley. Escape to the hills, lest you be swept away. Even now, Lot bargains. He's afraid of the hills. he asks for permission to flee to a small nearby town called Zor, and the angels, in a final act of patience, agree. "Hurry, escape there," the angel says, "for I can do nothing till you arrive there." The judgment is being held back, waiting for the last righteous remnant to be clear. Lot and his daughters reach the safety of Zor just as the sun is rising over the earth. And then the judgment falls. It comes not from the ground up, but from the sky down. Then the Lord rained on Sodom and Gomorrah sulfur and fire from the Lord out of heaven. It's a picture of a volcanic-like eruption from the sky, a terrifying, superheated storm of burning rock and noxious gas. The entire plain, with its lush fields and prosperous cities, is instantly incinerated. Everything is overturned. The cities, the inhabitants, and everything that grew on the ground. It is an absolute, fiery, and final destruction. And in that moment of cataclysm, we have one of the saddest verses in Genesis. Lot's wife, trailing behind him, disobeys the one command they were given. She looked back. Why? Was it a longing for her home, for her friends, for the life she knew, wicked as it was? Was it a flicker of doubt, a divided heart? We'll never know for sure. But in that backward glance, her fate was sealed. She became a pillar of salt, a stark, lonely monument on the edge of the dead plain, an eternal warning against the danger of a lingering affection for a world under judgment. The final scene of the story returns to Abraham. Early that morning, he goes to the place where he had stood before the Lord, the place where he had bargained so passionately for the lives of the righteous. He looks out towards Sodom and Gomorrah and the whole Jordan Valley, and he sees a thick, black smoke rising from the land, like the smoke of a furnace. There had not been 10 righteous people. There had not even been 5. There was only one family, and they were saved not by their own merits, but by God's memory of his friend. God remembered Abraham, the text says, and sent Lot out of the midst of the overthrow. Abraham's intercession had not saved the city, but it had saved his kin. The story of Sodom is a stark and terrifying story of judgment. But as we journey forward in time, down through the generations of Abraham's family, we come to a new kind of disaster and a very different kind of story. We move from Abraham's great-grandsons, the 12 sons of Jacob, who would become the 12 tribes of Israel, and we focus on one of them, Joseph. His story is not about a sudden, fiery apocalypse, but a slow, creeping catastrophe, a disaster of drought and dust. And it's a story not of destruction, but of a long, intricate, and masterfully woven plan of redemption. It begins, as so many troubles do, with jealousy within a family. Joseph was the 17th son of Jacob, but the firstborn of his beloved wife, Rachel. Jacob made no secret of his favoritism. He gave Joseph a special gift, a coat of many colors, a garment that was likely a long-sleeved, ornate robe signifying him as the heir, a prince among his brothers who were shepherds in simple tunics. This visible sign of favoritism planted a seed of bitterness in the hearts of his 10 older brothers. And Joseph, in the arrogance of youth, didn't help matters. He had 2 dreams, and he foolishly told them to his family. In the first, he dreamt that his brothers' sheaves of grain in the field bowed down to a sheaf. In the second, he dreamt that the sun, moon, and 11 stars were bowing down to him. The meaning was obvious. He was destined to rule over them. His brothers' jealousy now boiled over into outright hatred. The breaking point came one day when Jacob sent Joseph to check on his brothers, who were grazing the flocks many miles away. They saw him coming in the distance, his colorful coat making him easy to spot, and they saw their opportunity. "Here comes this dreamer," they sneered. They conspired to kill him, to throw him into a pit and claim a wild animal had devoured him. Only Reuben, the eldest, had some conscience and suggested they just throw him in the pit alive, planning to rescue him later. So they grabbed Joseph, stripped him of his precious coat, and threw him into a dry cistern. And then, in a chilling display of their callousness, they sat down to eat a meal. While they were eating, a caravan of Ishmaelite traders on their way to Egypt passed by. Judah, another brother, had a pragmatic idea. Why kill him and have his blood on their hands? "Let us sell him to the Ishmaelites," he suggested. And so they did. They pulled Joseph out of the pit and sold him for 20 shekels of silver. Their younger brother, their own flesh and blood, sold as a piece of merchandise. To cover their crime, they dipped his beautiful coat in the blood of a goat and brought it back to their father, Jacob. The old man was utterly deceived and plunged into a grief so deep he refused all comfort, believing for years that his beloved son was dead. Joseph, meanwhile, was taken down to Egypt, a land with a foreign language, foreign gods, and a foreign culture. He was sold in the slave market to a man named Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard. Here, Joseph's story could have ended, a tragic tale of betrayal and loss. But the Bible introduces a key phrase that changes everything. The Lord was with Joseph. Despite his circumstances, Joseph did not despair. He worked hard with integrity and skill, and because the Lord was with him, he prospered. Potiphar saw this. He saw that everything this young Hebrew slave touched seemed to succeed. So he promoted him, putting him in charge of his entire household. For a time, things were stable. Joseph had found a measure of success, even in slavery, but his character was about to be tested again. He was a handsome young man, and Potiphar's wife began to look at him with desire. Day after day, she tried to seduce him, and day after day, Joseph refused. His reasoning is a testament to his deep integrity. "My master has entrusted everything to me," he told her. "How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God?" He was loyal to his earthly master, but his ultimate accountability was to his heavenly one. Enraged by his rejection, she devised a wicked plan. She grabbed his garment as he was running from her, and then used it as false evidence, accusing him of attempting to assault her. Potiphar, enraged, had Joseph thrown into the royal prison, from the head of the household to the bottom of the dungeon. It was another devastating, unjust blow. And again, his story could have ended there. But again, we read those crucial words, But the Lord was with Joseph. Even in the darkness of the prison, Joseph's character shone. He was put in charge of the other prisoners, and the jailer trusted him completely. God's favor was still upon him. 2 years passed, 2 long, silent years in the darkness. Then 2 of Pharaoh's officials, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker, were thrown into the same prison. One night, they both had dreams that left them deeply troubled. Joseph, seeing their distress, offered to help. "Do not interpretations belong to God?" he said. "Please tell them to me." He interpreted their dreams with perfect accuracy. The cupbearer would be restored to his position in 3 days. The baker would be executed in 3 days. And it happened exactly as he had said. Joseph's only request to the cupbearer was, "Remember me when it is well with you, and show kindness to me, and mention me to Pharaoh, and get me out of this house." But the cupbearer, once restored to his privileged position, forgot. Joseph was left to languish in prison for 2 more full years. Then came the crisis that would change everything. Pharaoh himself, the most powerful man on earth, had 2 deeply disturbing dreams. In the first, he saw 7 fat, healthy cows come out of the Nile River, and they were devoured by 7 ugly, gaunt cows who remained as gaunt as before. In the second, he saw 7 full, healthy heads of grain growing on a single stalk, and they were swallowed up by 7 thin, blighted heads of grain. Pharaoh woke up terrified. He summoned all the magicians and wise men of Egypt, but no one could tell him what the dreams meant. It was only then that the cupbearer's conscience was pricked. He remembered the young Hebrew man in the prison. And so Joseph, after all those years, was hastily brought out of the dungeon. He was shaved and given fresh clothes and brought before the king of Egypt. Pharaoh told him the dreams, and Joseph, with the same humility he always showed, replied, "It is not in me. God will give Pharaoh a favorable answer." And then, with divine clarity, Joseph laid it all out. The 2 dreams were one and the same message from God. The 7 fat cows and the 7 healthy heads of grain represented 7 years of great abundance and plenty that were coming to Egypt. The 7 gaunt cows and the 7 blighted heads of grain represented 7 years of devastating famine that would follow. A famine so severe it would consume all the abundance and ruin the land. The dream was doubled. Joseph explained, because the matter was fixed by God and would happen soon. But Joseph didn't stop there. He didn't just provide an interpretation, he provided a solution. He laid out a detailed administrative plan. Let Pharaoh select a discerning and wise man and set him over the land of Egypt, he advised. He should appoint overseers, and during the 7 good years, they should take 1/5 of the harvest and store it in great granaries in the cities. This stored grain would be the food reserve for the 7 years of famine, so that the nation would not perish. Pharaoh and his officials were astounded by the clarity and wisdom of this plan, and they were astounded by the man who delivered it. Pharaoh said to his servants, "Can we find a man like this, in whom is the Spirit of God?" He turned to Joseph and declared, "Since God has shown you all this, there is none so discerning and wise as you are. You shall be over my house, and all my people shall rule themselves according to your word. Only in the throne will I be greater than you. In a single day, Joseph went from being a forgotten prisoner to being the prime minister, the vizier of Egypt. He was given Pharaoh's signet ring, fine linen clothes, a gold chain, and a new Egyptian name, Zaphanath-Paneah. He was 30 years old. The boy who was sold into slavery because of his dreams was now exalted to the highest power because of them. For the next 7 years, everything happened as Joseph had foreseen. The harvests were unbelievably abundant. Joseph traveled throughout Egypt, organizing the collection and storage of the grain. He stored up so much grain that he stopped keeping records. It was like the sand of the sea. And then the good years ended. The 7 years of famine began, just as Joseph had said. The drought and blight weren't just in Egypt, the text says. The famine was over all the face of the earth. It was a global catastrophe. In Canaan, in Syria, in all the surrounding lands, the crops failed. The earth turned to dust. Desperation set in. But in Egypt, there was bread. When the people of Egypt cried out to Pharaoh for food, his command was simple: go to Joseph. What he says to you, do. Joseph opened the storehouses and sold grain to the Egyptians, saving the nation. And soon, people from all the surrounding countries began to stream into Egypt to buy grain from him. For the famine was severe everywhere. And that is how, one day, 10 familiar figures appeared before the vizier of Egypt, bowing low to the ground. They were his brothers. They had come from Canaan, sent by their father Jacob to buy food to keep the family from starving. They bowed before this powerful Egyptian ruler, their faces to the ground, and they had no idea who he was. But Joseph recognized them instantly. And in that moment, his first dream came true. Their sheaves were bowing down to his. Joseph was overcome with emotion, but he concealed it. He spoke to them harshly through an interpreter, accusing them of being spies. He wanted to test them. He wanted to see if the cruel, selfish men who had sold him into slavery had changed at all. They desperately proclaimed their innocence, telling him about their family, that they were 12 brothers. One was no more, and the youngest was at home with their father. Joseph devised a test. He kept one brother, Simeon, as a hostage in prison, and sent the others home with grain, but with a stark command. They were not to return unless they brought their youngest brother, Benjamin, with them. The journey home was fraught with anxiety, which turned to terror when they discovered that the money they had paid for the grain had been secretly returned to their sacks. They saw it as a sign that God was punishing them. When they got home and told their father Jacob what had happened, he was distraught. "You have bereaved me of my children," he cried. "Joseph is no more, and Simeon is no more, and now you would take Benjamin. All this is against me." He refused to let Benjamin go. But the famine was relentless. The grain ran out. The family was starving. Finally, Judah, who had first suggested selling Joseph, stepped forward and made a solemn vow to his father. He personally guaranteed Benjamin's safety. "I will be a pledge for his safety," he said. "If I do not bring him back to you, then let me bear the blame forever." With a heavy heart, Jacob finally agreed. So they made the long journey back to Egypt with Benjamin, and with double the money, plus a gift for the powerful ruler. When Joseph saw that Benjamin was with them, he ordered his steward to prepare a great feast for them at his home. The brothers were terrified, assuming they were being trapped because of the money in their sacks. But they were treated as honored guests. Joseph entered and asked about their father, the old man, and he looked at his own younger brother, Benjamin, the only other son of his mother Rachel. And he was so overcome with emotion, he had to leave the room to weep. But the final test was yet to come. As they were preparing to leave, Joseph secretly ordered his personal silver cup to be placed in Benjamin's sack of grain. After they had left the city, he sent his steward after them to discover the cup. The brothers were outraged at the accusation of theft, so certain of their innocence that they declared that whoever had the cup should be put to death, and the rest would become slaves. The steward searched their sacks from oldest to youngest, and of course, the cup was found in Benjamin. Their despair was absolute. They tore their clothes and returned to the city, falling on the ground before Joseph. Joseph feigned anger. He declared that Benjamin must remain in Egypt as his slave, but the rest could go free. And this is the moment of truth. This is where the brothers prove they are no longer the same men who sat down to eat while Joseph was in the pit. Judah steps forward and delivers one of the most passionate, self-sacrificial speeches in the Old Testament. He explains that their father will die of grief if Benjamin does not return. He recounts the whole painful story, and then he offers himself. Therefore, please let your servant remain instead of the boy as a servant to my Lord, and let the boy go back with his brothers. For how can I go back to my father if the boy is not with me? I fear to see the evil that would find my father. He was willing to become a slave for the rest of his life to save his youngest brother and his father. That was all Joseph needed to see. The cycle of jealousy and betrayal was broken, replaced by a cycle of love and self-sacrifice. He could no longer control himself. He ordered all the Egyptians out of the room, and then, alone with his brothers, he broke down and wept so loudly that the entire palace could hear it. And through his tears, he said the words they could never have imagined. I am Joseph. Is my father still alive? His brothers were too stunned, too terrified to speak. And so Joseph said it again. And in his next words, he reframed the entire story of his life, turning 2 decades of pain and injustice into a testament of divine providence. Do not be distressed, he told his terrified brothers, and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. So then, it was not you who sent me here, but God. He saw it all with perfect clarity. Their evil act, born of jealousy, had been masterfully used by God as the instrument of their own salvation. The famine that was devastating the world became the backdrop against which God's intricate plan of redemption was revealed. Joseph arranged for his entire family, his father Jacob, and all his brothers and their households to come and live in Egypt, settling them in the best part of the land of Goshen. He nourished them and protected them through the remaining 5 years of the famine. The family that had been broken by hatred was reunited through a disaster, made whole again by the grace of a brother they had wronged, who saw the hand of God in every part of his story. The slow, creeping apocalypse of the famine, unlike the sudden fire on Sodom, became an instrument not of judgment, but of healing, a stage for the greatest story of forgiveness and reconciliation in the book of Genesis. The story of a famine, as we've seen, is what brought the family of Israel down into Egypt. They arrived as honored guests, a small clan of 70 people given refuge and the best of the land by a grateful Pharaoh who owed his kingdom's survival to Joseph. They settled in the fertile region of Goshen, and there they did exactly what God had told their ancestor Abraham to do. They were fruitful and multiplied, and they did so exceedingly. The years turned into decades, the decades into centuries. The small family clan grew into a vast and numerous people, a nation within a nation. But the memory of Joseph, the Hebrew vizier who had saved Egypt, faded with time. The dynasty of pharaohs who had welcomed him was eventually replaced by a new line of kings. And the scripture tells us, in a sentence pregnant with foreboding, that there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph. This new Pharaoh looked out at the burgeoning Israelite population not with friendship, but with fear. He saw their numbers not as a blessing, but as a threat. "Behold," he said to his officials, "the people of Israel are too many and too mighty for us. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply. And if war breaks out, they join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land." The politics of fear took root, and the solution was oppression. The Israelites were transformed from welcome residents into state slaves. Taskmasters were set over them to afflict them with heavy burdens. They were forced to build the great store cities of Pithom and Ramses, laboring under the hot Egyptian sun, their days filled with the grueling work of making bricks and mortar. The goal was to crush their spirits, to break them with bitter labor. But the opposite happened. The more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied, and the more they spread abroad. Pharaoh's fear intensified, and his cruelty escalated. He summoned the Hebrew midwives, Shiphrah and Puah, and gave them a horrific, secret command. When you attend to the Hebrew women at childbirth, he ordered, if it is a son, you shall kill him. But if it is a daughter, she shall live. It was an order for systematic, gender-selective infanticide. But the midwives feared God more than they feared the king of Egypt, and they disobeyed the order, letting the boys live. When Pharaoh confronted them, they cleverly replied that the Hebrew women were so vigorous they gave birth before the midwives could even arrive. Thwarted, Pharaoh escalated his policy from a secret order to a public decree, a command to all his people. Every son that is born to the Hebrews you shall cast into the Nile, but every daughter you shall save alive. The Nile River, the very source of Egypt's life, its sacred artery, was to become a graveyard for the sons of Israel. It was in this time of utter darkness, under this sentence of death, that a child was born to a man and woman from the tribe of Levi. He was a beautiful child, And his mother, seeing this, defied the king's decree and hid him for 3 months. But you cannot hide a growing baby for long. When she could hide him no longer, she devised a desperate plan born of a mother's love. She took a papyrus basket, waterproofed it with bitumen and pitch, and placed her child inside. She then placed the small, floating ark among the reeds along the bank of the Nile. His older sister, a young girl named Miriam, stood at a distance to see what would become of him. And then Providence stepped in. Pharaoh's own daughter came down to the Nile to bathe. She saw the basket among the reeds and sent her servant girl to retrieve it. When she opened it, she saw the baby, and he was crying. And her heart was moved with compassion. "This is one of the Hebrews' children," she said. At that moment, Miriam cleverly stepped forward. "Shall I go and call you a nurse from the Hebrew women to nurse the child for you?" she asked. Pharaoh's daughter agreed, and so Miriam went and called the child's own mother. In a beautiful twist of irony, the baby's mother was hired, paid by the princess, to nurse her own son. And when the child was old enough, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. She named him Moses, which sounds like the Hebrew word meaning to draw out, for she said, "I drew him out of the water." The boy who was supposed to be drowned in the Nile was raised in the palace of the man who had ordered his death. Moses grew up as a prince of Egypt. He would have received the finest education, been trained in military strategy, literature, and the complex theology of the Egyptian gods. He wore the fine linens of an Egyptian noble and spoke their language perfectly. But he knew who he was. The scripture says that when he had grown up, he went out to his people and looked on their burdens. His heart was with his enslaved kinsmen, not with his privileged adopters. One day, his simmering sense of justice boiled over. He saw an Egyptian taskmaster beating a Hebrew slave. Looking around and seeing no one, he killed the Egyptian and buried him in the sand. He had tried to take matters into his own hands, to be a deliverer on his own terms. The next day, he went out and saw 2 Hebrews fighting. When he tried to intervene, one of them sneered, "Who made you a prince and a judge over us? Do you mean to kill me as you killed the Egyptian?" The secret was out. Moses knew he was in danger. And sure enough, when Pharaoh heard of it, he sought to kill Moses. And so Moses fled. He ran from Egypt, from his title, from his past, and from his failed attempt at being a hero. He ran east into the vast, empty wilderness of Midian. He sat down by a well, a refugee with nothing to his name. And there he had another encounter, defending the 7 daughters of a Midianite priest named Jethro from some shepherds who were trying to drive them away. For his chivalry, he was welcomed into Jethro's home. And there, in the quiet expanse of the desert, the prince of Egypt became a shepherd. He married one of Jethro's daughters, Zipporah, and had a son. For 40 years, Moses lived in anonymity. 40 years of leading sheep through the rocky, silent landscape. The pride and impatience of the Egyptian prince were slowly worn away by the patient, monotonous rhythm of the wilderness. He learned the ways of the desert, the names of the stars, the locations of the hidden springs. He was being emptied of himself, being prepared for a purpose he could not have imagined. He was learning to be nobody so that God could make him somebody. Meanwhile, back in Egypt, the king who had sought Moses' life died. But the suffering of the Israelites did not end. A new Pharaoh sat on the throne, and the bondage continued. Their groaning under the slavery went up to God. And the Bible says that God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. God saw the people of Israel, and God knew. The time of waiting was over. The time for deliverance had come. One day, Moses was leading his flock on the far side of the wilderness, and he came to Horeb, the mountain of God. And there he saw something extraordinary. An angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out of the midst of a bush. He looked, and behold, the bush was burning, yet it was not consumed. It was a paradox, a piece of the ordinary world touched by the fire of the divine, yet not destroyed by it. Intrigued, Moses turned aside to get a closer look at this strange sight. And when the Lord saw that he had turned aside, he called to him from the bush, "Moses, Moses." And Moses, startled, replied, "Here I am." "Do not come near," the voice warned. "Take your sandals off your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground." The voice continued, "I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob." And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. Then God spoke the words that would change the course of history. "I have surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt, and have heard their cry because of their taskmasters. I know their sufferings, and I have come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians, and to bring them up out of that land to a good and broad land, a land flowing with milk and honey." And then came the commission, the words that must have struck the 80-year-old shepherd as completely insane. "Come," God said, "I will send you to Pharaoh that you may bring my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt." Moses was stunned. The last time he had tried to play the deliverer, he had ended up a murderer and a fugitive. His response was immediate and full of doubt. "Who am I," he stammered, "that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the children of Israel out of Egypt?" It was a reasonable question. He was a wanted man in Egypt, a humble shepherd, a man stripped of all status and power. And God's answer was simple, yet profound. "But I will be with you." The success of the mission would not depend on who Moses was, but on who was with him. Moses had another question, a deeper one. If he goes to the Israelites and tells them, "The God of your fathers has sent me," they will ask, "What is his name? What should he say?" And God replied with the most mysterious and powerful revelation of his name in the entire Old Testament. "I am who I am," he said. In Hebrew, the name is Yahweh. It speaks of a God who is self-existent, eternal, a God who is not defined by anything else, but simply is. "Say this to the people of Israel," God commanded. "I am has sent me to you." Still, Moses hesitated. "But behold," he argued, "they will not believe me or listen to my voice, for they will say, 'The Lord did not appear to you.'" So God gave him 3 signs. He told Moses to throw his shepherd's staff on the ground, and it became a serpent. He told him to pick it up by the tail, and it became a staff again. He told him to put his hand inside his cloak, and when he drew it out, it was leprous, white as snow. He put it back in, and it was restored. The third sign would be to take water from the Nile and pour it on the dry ground, and it would become blood. Even with these signs, Moses was reluctant. He played his final card. "Oh, my Lord, I am not eloquent. I am slow of speech and of tongue." He was claiming he wasn't a good public speaker. God's response was a sharp reminder of who was in charge. Who has made man's mouth? Who makes him mute or deaf or seeing or blind? Is it not I, the Lord? Now therefore go, and I will be with your mouth and teach you what you shall speak. When Moses still begged God to send someone else, God's anger was kindled, but his patience still held. He told Moses that his own brother Aaron was already on his way to meet him, and that Aaron was an eloquent speaker. Aaron would be Moses' spokesman, his prophet. And so, with all his excuses exhausted, Moses agreed. He took his wife and sons, his shepherd's staff, now the staff of God, and began the long journey back to Egypt. The reunion of Moses and Aaron was followed by a gathering of the elders of Israel. Aaron spoke all the words God had given Moses, and Moses performed the signs. And the people, seeing the signs and hearing that God had seen their affliction, believed. They bowed their heads and worshipped. For the first time in centuries, hope flickered in the slave pits of Egypt. The first confrontation with Pharaoh did not go well. Moses and Aaron went before the throne and delivered their message, a message that must have sounded like utter nonsense to the man who considered himself a god on earth. "Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, let my people go, that they may hold a feast to me in the wilderness." Pharaoh's reply was filled with imperial scorn. "Who is the Lord, that I should obey his voice and let Israel go? I do not know the Lord, and moreover, I will not let Israel go." Not only did he refuse, but he used their request as a pretext to increase their suffering. He accused the Israelites of being lazy. From now on, he decreed, they would still have to produce the same number of bricks, but they would no longer be given the straw to bind them. They would have to go and gather it themselves. It was an impossible quota. The Hebrew foremen were beaten when they couldn't meet it. The people's newfound hope turned to despair, and they turned on Moses and Aaron. "You have made us stink in the sight of Pharaoh," they cried. Moses, crushed, went back to the Lord. "Why have you brought this trouble on this people? Why did you ever send me?" And God reassured him. "Now you shall see what I will do to Pharaoh. I will redeem you with an outstretched arm and with great acts of judgment." The stage was now set for a contest, a divine showdown. It would be the God of the slaves against all the gods of the mighty Egyptian empire. And the weapons would be a series of escalating disasters we now call the 10 plagues. The first plague was a direct assault on the heart of Egypt itself, the Nile River. The Nile was everything to Egypt. It was their source of water, their highway for transport, the source of the fertile silt that made their agriculture possible. They worshipped it as a god happy. So Moses and Aaron met Pharaoh at the riverbank. There, as commanded, Aaron struck the water of the Nile with his staff, and in the sight of Pharaoh and all his servants, the water was turned into blood, not just colored red, but transformed. The fish in the river died, and the river began to stink. The Egyptians couldn't drink from it. The lifeblood of their nation had become a putrid river of death. Pharaoh's magicians, however, were able to replicate the trick on a small scale. And so Pharaoh's heart was hardened, and he turned and went into his house, unimpressed. For 7 days, the land of Egypt suffered, digging for water along the banks of the polluted river, while the Israelites in Goshen presumably had fresh water. The second plague emerged from the corrupted river. God commanded Moses to tell Aaron to stretch out his hand over the waters, and frogs swarmed out of the Nile. They covered everything. They were in the houses, in the bedrooms, on the beds, in the ovens and the kneading bowls. There was no escape. The frog was associated with the goddess Hecate, a goddess of fertility. Now, her symbol had become a disgusting, croaking pestilence. This time, the sheer annoyance of the plague was too much. Pharaoh summoned Moses and Aaron. "Plead with the Lord to take away the frogs from me and from my people," he begged, "and I will let the people go." Moses agreed and asked Pharaoh to set the time. Pharaoh, perhaps testing him, said, "Tomorrow." The next day, at Moses' word, the frogs died. They were gathered into great, stinking heaps, and the land reeked. But as soon as there was relief, Pharaoh hardened his heart and broke his promise. The third plague was different. Aaron struck the dust of the earth with his staff, and the dust became gnats. Tiny, biting insects that swarmed over man and beast. This plague was significant because, for the first time, Pharaoh's magicians could not replicate it. They tried, but they failed. They went to Pharaoh and admitted defeat. "This," they said, "is the finger of God." But even the testimony of his own experts did not move Pharaoh. His heart remained hard. For the fourth plague, God made a distinction. He sent thick swarms of flies to torment the Egyptians, to fill their houses and cover the ground. But he declared the land of Goshen, where the Israelites lived, would be untouched. "That you may know that I am the Lord in the midst of the earth," God said. This was the first time a clear geographical line was drawn between the Egyptians and the Hebrews. The disaster was not random, it was targeted. Again, the plague was unbearable. Pharaoh called for Moses and tried to negotiate. He offered to let them sacrifice within Egypt. Moses refused, knowing it would be an abomination to the Egyptians. Pharaoh then relented. "I will let you go, only do not go very far away." But once again, as soon as Moses prayed and the flies were gone, Pharaoh hardened his heart and refused to let them go. Fifth plague struck at the Egyptian economy and their religion. It was a severe pestilence on their livestock. The horses, the donkeys, the camels, the herds, and the flocks of the Egyptians died. This was a devastating economic blow, and also a direct challenge to the many animal-headed gods of Egypt, like the cow goddess Hathor. And again, God made a clear distinction. Of the livestock of the Israelites, not one died. Pharaoh sent investigators to confirm this. They reported back that it was true. Yet even this proof did not sway him. His heart remained hard. The sixth plague became painfully personal. God instructed Moses and Aaron to take handfuls of soot from a furnace, and for Moses to throw it in the air in front of Pharaoh. The fine dust settled on the people and animals throughout Egypt and became boils, festering sores breaking out on their bodies. This time, the magicians could not even stand before Moses because they too were afflicted. The plague was upon them. The text at this point shifts slightly. For the first time, it says not just that Pharaoh's heart was hard, but that the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart. It marks a new stage in this contest, where Pharaoh's own stubbornness is now sealed by a divine judgment. His path of resistance now fixed. Before the seventh plague, God sent a more detailed and solemn warning. He told Pharaoh that this time he would send the full force of his plagues to show him that there is none like me in all the earth. He explained that he could have wiped out the Egyptians already, but he had let them live for this purpose, to show them his power, so that his name might be proclaimed in all the earth. The warning was an act of mercy. He told them to bring their livestock and servants in from the fields, because a storm was coming unlike any seen before in Egypt. Some of Pharaoh's servants who feared the word of the Lord listened and brought their people to safety. Others did not. Then Moses stretched out his staff, and the Lord sent a terrifying storm of thunder, hail, and fire. Great hailstones, with fire flashing within them, rained down from the sky, shattering everything in their path. It destroyed people, animals, and what was left of the crops. The devastation was immense. But in the land of Goshen, there was no hail. This time, Pharaoh seemed truly broken. He sent for Moses and Aaron and confessed, "This time I have sinned, the Lord is in the right, and I and my people are in the wrong." He begged them to plead with God to stop the storm, and he promised to let them go. But Moses knew his heart. As soon as the storm ceased and there was silence, Pharaoh sinned yet again, and he and his servants hardened their hearts. The eighth plague was a terrifying follow-up. What the hail had left, the locusts would eat. Moses and Aaron warned Pharaoh of a swarm so dense it would cover the face of the land and darken the sky. Pharaoh's own officials now begged him to relent. "Do you not yet understand that Egypt is ruined?" they pleaded. Pharaoh seemed to waver, but his pride returned, and he drove Moses and Aaron from his presence. And so the locusts came. A great east wind blew them in, and they covered the land, devouring every last green thing that the hail had not destroyed. The land was stripped bare. Pharaoh hastily summoned Moses again, confessing his sin and begging for forgiveness, just this once. Moses prayed. A strong west wind came and blew the locusts into the Red Sea. And once again, the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart. The ninth plague was a masterpiece of psychological warfare and a direct assault on Pharaoh's chief deity, the sun god Ra. Moses stretched his hand toward heaven, and a thick darkness descended upon the land of Egypt. It was not the darkness of a cloudy day or a moonless night. It was a tangible darkness, a darkness that could be felt. For 3 days, no one could see anyone else, and no one dared to move. The entire nation was paralyzed in a terrifying, silent, black void. It was the ultimate demonstration that the God of the Hebrews had power over the God of the sun. And in the homes of the Israelites in Goshen, there was light. After 3 days, Pharaoh, his voice likely strained from the terror, called for Moses. He made a final, compromised offer. Go, serve the Lord, your little ones also may go with you. Only let your flocks and your herds remain. But Moses refused. They would need their flocks for sacrifices. Not a hoof would be left behind. And at this, Pharaoh's patience finally snapped. His heart was so hard, so full of rage, that he issued a final threat to Moses. Get away from me. Take care never to see my face again, for on the day you see my face, you shall die. Moses' reply was calm and final. As you say, I will not see your face again. The negotiations were over. Now came the final, most devastating blow. The 10th plague. God had already told Moses what was to come. A judgment that would finally break the will of Egypt. About midnight, God would pass through Egypt, and every firstborn male would die. From the firstborn of Pharaoh, who sits on the throne, to the firstborn of the slave girl at her grinding wheel, to the firstborn of the cattle. A great cry of anguish would rise up from Egypt. But among the people of Israel, not even a dog would bark. It would be the final, terrible distinction. But before the judgment came, there was an instruction for deliverance. This is the origin of the Passover. God commanded every Israelite family to take a lamb, a male a year old, without blemish. On the 14th day of the month, they were to slaughter the lamb at twilight, and they were to take some of its blood and put it on the 2 doorposts and the lintel of their houses. The blood was to be a sign, for I will pass through the land of Egypt that night, God said, and I will strike all the firstborn in the land of Egypt. And when I see the blood, I will pass over you, and no plague will befall you to destroy you. The meal they were to eat that night was also prescribed. They were to roast the lamb and eat it with unleavened bread and bitter herbs. And they were to eat it in a hurry, dressed and ready to travel, their belts fastened, their sandals on their feet, and their staff in their hand. It was a meal of redemption, but also a meal of departure. And so, on that fateful night, 2 very different scenes played out in the land of Egypt. In the homes of the Egyptians, a sense of dread perhaps, but life as usual. In the homes of the Israelites in Goshen, a quiet, tense, and hopeful obedience. Families gathered inside, the lamb eaten, the blood smeared on the wood of their doors. They waited in the darkness, listening, and at midnight the Lord passed through. The destroying angel moved through the streets and villages of Egypt, and the judgment fell. In every house not marked by the blood of the lamb, the firstborn died. Pharaoh awoke to the news that his own son, his heir, was dead. And the same news was coming from every corner of his kingdom. A great, shattering cry of grief rose up from the Egyptian people, for there was not a house where someone was not dead. The pride of Egypt, its future, was destroyed in a single night. Pharaoh's iron will was finally and utterly broken. He summoned Moses and Aaron in the middle of the night. His imperial scorn was gone, replaced by desperate panic. Up, go out from among my people, you and the people of Israel, and go, Serve the Lord as you have said. Take your flocks and your herds as you have said, and be gone. And bless me also." The Egyptians, terrified that they would all die, urged the Israelites to leave quickly. They loaded them up with gifts of silver and gold and clothing, just as God had promised. They were, in effect, paying them for their centuries of slave labor. And so, after 430 years to the very day, the great Exodus began. A vast multitude of about 600,000 men on foot, besides women and children, marched out of Egypt. They were no longer a band of slaves. They were a redeemed nation. They carried with them the unleavened dough from their Passover meal, because they had been driven out in such haste. They carried the plunder of Egypt, and they carried the bones of Joseph, fulfilling an oath made centuries before. They were not wandering aimlessly. The Lord himself went before them, leading them in a pillar of cloud by day to show them the way, and in a pillar of fire by night to give them light. The 10 plagues, a series of terrifying and destructive disasters, had served their ultimate purpose. They had not just dismantled Egypt's economy and mocked its gods. They had carved a path to freedom. The God who had heard the groaning of his people had come down, and with an outstretched arm and mighty acts of judgment, had set his people free. Freedom has a sound. For the Israelites, it was the sound of 600,000 pairs of sandals hitting the dusty road out of Egypt, the lowing of cattle, the murmur of 1,000,000 hopeful voices, and the triumphant crash of the Red Sea closing over the last of Pharaoh's chariots. The mighty Egyptian army, the very symbol of their oppression, was gone, washed away in a final, spectacular act of divine deliverance. Standing on the far shore, watching the water calm, the people of Israel saw the salvation of the Lord, and they sang. Led by Miriam, Moses' sister, they sang a song of victory, a song of a God who had thrown the horse and its rider into the sea. The taste of freedom was sweet, and the future seemed as bright as the pillar of fire that would guide them by night. But the wilderness is a harsh teacher, and the euphoria of liberation doesn't last long when your water runs out. After 3 days of marching into the desert, they found water at a place called Marah, but it was bitter, undrinkable, and the sweet song of freedom quickly turned into the bitter grumbling of complaint. "What shall we drink?" they cried out against Moses. The memory of God's miraculous salvation at the sea seemed to evaporate in the heat of their present thirst. Their instinct was not to pray, but to protest. Moses, in turn, cried out to the Lord, and God showed him a piece of wood. When Moses threw it into the water became sweet. It was their first lesson in the wilderness. God's provision often comes in unexpected ways, and it follows a cry of faith, not a cry of complaint. It was there at Marah that God tested them, promising that if they would listen to his voice and keep his statutes, the diseases he had brought on the Egyptians would not touch them. The lessons came thick and fast. A little further on, their food ran out, and again the grumbling began, this time laced with a strange, selective nostalgia for the lives they had just escaped. Would that we had died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt, they lamented to Moses and Aaron, when we sat by the meat pots and ate bread to the full. For you have brought us out into this wilderness to kill this whole assembly with hunger. It's a staggering statement. In their minds, the certainty of a full stomach in slavery had become preferable to the uncertainty of freedom with God. They remembered the food, but they had conveniently forgotten the whips, the forced labor, and the state-sanctioned murder of their children. And again, God's response was not anger, but grace, a patient, miraculous provision. He told Moses he would rain bread from heaven for them, and so it began. Every morning, when the dew lifted, the ground was covered with a fine, flake-like substance, like frost. The people had no idea what it was. Man who, they asked, which means, what is it? And that became its name, manna. It tasted like wafers made with honey. God's instructions for it were very specific, a daily lesson in trust and obedience. They were to gather only enough for one day. Anyone who tried to hoard it would find it full of worms and stinking by the next morning. It was a call to live in daily dependence, to trust that God would provide again tomorrow, just as he had today. And on the 6th day, they were to gather a double portion, for the 7th day was the Sabbath, a day of rest, and on that day no manna would appear. When they craved meat, God sent a great wind that brought flocks of quail, which fell in and around the camp. For 40 years, for the entire duration of their time in the wilderness, the people of Israel ate manna. God sustained them, day in and day out, in a land that offered nothing. But this pattern, crisis, complaint, provision, was a symptom of a much deeper problem. God was trying to transform a nation of slaves into a people of covenant. But the slave mentality, with its fear, its short-sightedness, and its distrust of authority, was hard to break. The greatest test and their greatest failure came at the foot of the very mountain where Moses had first met God in the burning bush, Mount Sinai. God had descended on the mountain in fire and smoke, and the people trembled at his awesome power. He had made a covenant with them, giving them his law, the 10 Commandments, as a blueprint for how to live as his holy people. And they had all agreed, all that the Lord has spoken, we will do. Then Moses went up the mountain into the cloud of God's presence to receive the law inscribed on tablets of stone. He was gone for 40 days and 40 nights. Down below, in the camp, the people grew restless. Their leader was gone. The terrifying, invisible God of the mountain was silent. Their faith, so dependent on visible signs, began to waver. They gathered around Aaron, Moses' brother and high priest, with a demand. Up, make us gods who shall go before us. As for this Moses, the man who brought us up out of the land of Egypt, we do not know what has become of him. It was a catastrophic failure of memory and faith. They wanted a God they could see, a God they could control, a God like the ones they had known in Egypt. And Aaron, in a moment of stunning weakness, gave in to them. He told them to bring their gold earrings, and he melted them down and fashioned the molten gold into the image of a young bull, a golden calf. common symbol of power and fertility among the gods of Egypt and Canaan. He built an altar before it, and the people made a declaration of utter apostasy. "These are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt. They offered sacrifices, they ate, they drank, and they rose up to play." It was a full-blown pagan festival at the foot of God's holy mountain. Upon the mountain, God's wrath was kindled. He told Moses what the people had done and declared his intention to destroy them and start over with Moses. But Moses, in that moment, became a true leader of his people. He interceded for them. He stood in the gap between a holy God and a sinful nation, and he pleaded for them, not on the basis of their merit, but on the basis of God's own character and promises. He reminded God of his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He appealed to God's reputation among the nations, and God relented. Moses descended the mountain, his face ablaze with a residual holiness, carrying the 2 stone tablets inscribed by the finger of God. As he and his young assistant Joshua drew near the camp, they heard the sound of singing, and then they saw it: the calf, the dancing, the orgy of idolatry, and Moses' anger burned. He threw the 2 tablets to the ground, shattering them at the foot of the mountain, a powerful, symbolic act showing that the people had already shattered the covenant written on them. He seized the golden calf, burned it in the fire, ground it to powder, scattered it on the water, and made the people of Israel drink it. He made them ingest the very substance of their sin. Then came a terrible reckoning, as the sons of Levi rallied to Moses and purged the camp of the ringleaders. And after that, the Lord sent a plague on the people, a deadly reminder of the consequences of their betrayal. This was a disaster of their own making, a spiritual cataclysm that revealed the deep sickness in their hearts. The 40 years in the wilderness would be filled with such moments of rebellion and judgment. The people complained about the manna, calling it worthless food. They grumbled about the lack of water at Kadesh, and Moses, in a moment of angry disobedience, struck the rock for water instead of speaking to it as God commanded, a sin for which he himself would be barred from entering the promised land. A whole generation, the generation that had seen the wonders of the Exodus, was condemned to wander until they died in the desert because of their unbelief and refusal to enter the land when they first had the chance. The wilderness was not just a journey. It was a graveyard for a faithless generation, one of the most dramatic and terrifying instances of discipline came from within the leadership itself. A Levite named Korah, along with 2 other leaders named Dathan and Abiram, gathered 250 prominent men and mounted a direct rebellion against the authority of Moses and Aaron. They stood before them and made their accusation. "You have gone too far, for all the congregation are holy, every one of them, and the Lord is among them. Why then do you exalt yourselves above the assembly of the Lord?" It was a rebellion couched in pious-sounding language, but at its heart, it was about power and pride. Moses was deeply grieved. He proposed a test. The next day, Korah and his 250 followers were to take their fire pans, their censers, and come before the tabernacle. Aaron would do the same, and God himself would show whom he had chosen. The next morning, the rebels assembled, bold and defiant. The glory of the Lord appeared, and God told Moses and Aaron to get away from the assembly, for he was about to consume them. Again, Moses and Aaron fell on their faces and interceded for the people. God relented from destroying everyone, but commanded the people to get away from the tents of the three main conspirators. Moses then made a solemn proclamation. He told the people that they would know the Lord had sent him if something unprecedented happened. If these men died a natural death, then God was not with Moses. But he declared, if the Lord creates something new, and the ground opens its mouth and swallows them up with all that belongs to them, and they go down alive into Sheol, then you shall know that these men have despised the Lord. As soon as he finished speaking, the ground beneath the tents of Korah, Dathan, and Abiram split apart. With a terrifying rumble, the earth opened its mouth and swallowed them. Their families, their tents, their possessions, everything they owned, vanished into the chasm, and the earth closed over them. They were gone. At the same time, fire came out from the Lord and consumed the 250 men who were offering incense. The people fled in terror. But incredibly, the very next day, the congregation began to grumble again, this time against Moses and Aaron. You have killed the people of the Lord, they accused. Their hearts were still hard, and immediately a plague broke out among the people. It moved with terrifying speed. Moses yelled to Aaron to take his censer with burning coals and incense, and to run into the midst of the people to make atonement for them. Aaron ran and stood between the living and the dead, and the plague was stopped, but not before 14,700 people had died. It was a horrifying lesson in the sanctity of God's authority and the deadly consequences of rebellion. Another memorable disaster came later in their journey near the border of Edom. The people grew impatient, and they spoke against God and against Moses. Why have you brought us up out of Egypt to die in the wilderness? For there is no food and no water, and we loathe this worthless food. They were complaining about the manna again, the very bread from heaven that had sustained them for decades. This time, God's disciplinary response came from the ground itself. The Lord sent fiery serpents among the people. These were likely venomous snakes, whose bite caused a burning, inflammatory reaction. They swarmed through the camp, biting people, and many died. The terror of the serpents finally did what years of miracles had not. It brought them to a place of genuine repentance. They came to Moses and confessed, "We have sinned, for we have spoken against the Lord and against you. Pray to the Lord that he take away the serpents from us." So Moses prayed, and God's remedy was strange and profound. He did not simply remove the snakes. He told Moses, "Make a fiery serpent and set it on a pole, and everyone who is bitten when he sees it shall live." So Moses forged a serpent out of bronze and lifted it up on a standard in the middle of the camp. And a miracle occurred. Anyone who had been bitten, no matter how sick, no matter how close to death, if they would simply turn their eyes in faith and look at the bronze serpent on the pole. They were healed. It was a powerful lesson. Salvation came not through their own efforts, but through looking in faith to the unlikely provision that God had made for them. After 40 years, the generation that came out of Egypt had passed away. A new generation, born and raised in the wilderness, stood ready to enter the promised land. But the pattern of discipline did not end. It simply changed its context. Now, living in the land God had given them, the disasters they faced were often a direct result of their breaking the covenant. The book of Judges tells a sad, repeating story. The people would forget the Lord and worship the idols of the Canaanites around them. Then God would allow them to be oppressed by their enemies, a political and military disaster. The people would cry out in their misery, and God would raise up a judge, a deliverer, to save them. Then there would be peace for a time, until the cycle began again. Famines, too, were seen as a sign of divine judgment, such as the famine that drove Naomi and her family from Bethlehem, the house of bread, to the foreign land of Moab, setting the stage for the story of Ruth. This principle that national disaster was linked to national sin reaches its most dramatic expression centuries later, after the nation had split into two kingdoms. In the northern kingdom of Israel, a king named Ahab came to the throne, and the scripture gives him a chilling review. He did more to provoke the Lord, the God of Israel, to anger than all the kings of Israel who were before him. His wife was a foreign princess, Jezebel, a fanatical worshiper of the Canaanite god Baal. Together, they made Baal worship the state religion. Baal was believed to be the god of the storm, the one who rode the clouds, who brought the rain, who made the crops grow. To worship him was to ensure the nation's agricultural and economic prosperity. The worship of the one true God, Yahweh, was driven underground. His prophets were hunted down and executed by Jezebel. It was a time of deep spiritual darkness. Into this darkness strode a figure as rugged and uncompromising as the wilderness he came from, Elijah the Tishbite. He appeared seemingly out of nowhere, walked into the court of King Ahab, and made one of the boldest proclamations in history. Without preamble, he declared, "As the Lord, the God of Israel, lives, before whom I stand, there shall be neither dew nor rain these years, except by my word." It was a direct, targeted challenge. He didn't call for a debate or a theological argument. He declared war on Baal on his own turf. He essentially said to Ahab and all of Israel, "You think Baal controls the rain? Let's see. For the next few years, the skies will be shut, and the only one who holds the key is my God, the God of Israel." And then, as suddenly as he appeared, he was gone, sent by God to hide by a remote brook called Cherith. And the drought began. The vibrant green of the Jezreel Valley slowly faded to a sickly yellow, then to a dusty brown. The sky remained a cloudless, brilliant, merciless blue. The streams and rivers shrank, then disappeared altogether. The earth cracked open like a parched mouth. The crops withered in the fields. The livestock grew thin and began to die. It was a slow, creeping national catastrophe. For Ahab and Jezebel, it was a profound embarrassment. Their God, the God of rain, was silent and powerless. During this time, God provided for his prophet in miraculous ways. At the brook Cherith, the ravens, unclean birds, brought him bread and meat morning and evening. When the brook dried up, God sent him to a foreign town, Zarephath, in the heart of Baal's territory. There, a poor widow was gathering sticks, preparing to make one last small meal for herself and her son before they lay down to die of starvation. Elijah asked her for water and bread. She explained she had nothing left but a handful of flour in a jar and a little oil in a jug. And Elijah, speaking for God, made an incredible promise. The jar of flour shall not be spent, and the jug of oil shall not be empty, until the day that the Lord sends rain upon the earth. And she, in an act of profound faith, made him a small cake first. And the miracle held. For many days the three of them ate, and the jar and the jug never ran out. In the midst of national disaster, God carved out a small pocket of supernatural provision for those who trusted him. After 3.5 years, the land was desolate. The famine was so severe that King Ahab himself was out searching for any patch of grass to save the last of his horses. And it was then that God commanded Elijah to go and present himself to the king. The meeting was tense. "Is it you, you troubler of Israel?" Ahab snarled. Elijah's reply was fearless. "I have not troubled Israel, but you have, and your father's house, because you have abandoned the commandments of the Lord and followed the Baals." And then Elijah laid down the terms for the final showdown. He challenged Ahab to gather all of Israel at Mount Carmel. And he was to bring the 450 prophets of Baal and the 400 prophets of the goddess Asherah, who were all supported at Jezebel's royal table. And so they assembled on the mountain, the people gaunt and weary from the long famine, the king, and the two rival priesthoods. Elijah stood before the people and put the choice to them in stark terms. How long will you go limping between two different opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal, then follow him. The people, caught in their compromise, were silent. So Elijah proposed a contest. 2 bulls would be prepared as sacrifices, one for Baal and one for the Lord. They would be placed on 2 altars, but no fire would be lit. "And you call upon the name of your God," Elijah said to the prophets of Baal, "and I will call upon the name of the Lord, and the God who answers by fire, he is God." The people agreed that this was a fair test. The prophets of Baal went first. They prepared their bull and began their ritual. From morning until noon, they cried out, "O Baal, answer us." But there was no voice, no answer. They limped and danced around the altar they had made. As noon approached, Elijah began to mock them. "Cry aloud," he taunted them, "for he is a god. Either he is musing, or he is relieving himself, or he is on a journey, or perhaps he is asleep and must be awakened." Spurred on by his mockery, they cried even louder. They began to cut themselves with swords and lances, according to their custom, until the blood gushed out over them. They raved and prophesied all afternoon, but still there was nothing. No voice, no answer, no one paying attention. The God of lightning was silent. Then in the late afternoon, As the time for the evening sacrifice approached, Elijah told the people to come near. In the midst of the frantic, bloody chaos of the Baal worshippers, Elijah's actions were calm, deliberate, and restorative. He took 12 stones, one for each of the tribes of Israel, and he repaired the altar of the Lord, which had been thrown down. He dug a trench around it. He arranged the wood, cut the bull in pieces, and laid it on the wood. And then he did something that seemed utterly insane in the midst of a 3-year drought. "Fill 4 jars with water," he commanded, "and pour it on the burnt offering and on the wood." They did so. "Do it a second time," he said, and they did. "Do it a third time," and they did. Water, the most precious commodity in the kingdom, was poured out until it soaked the sacrifice, the wood, and filled the entire trench. There could be no possibility of trickery, no hidden spark. Then Elijah stepped forward and prayed. It was not a frantic shout or a bloody ritual. It was a simple, powerful prayer of faith. "O Lord, God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known this day that you are God in Israel, and that I am your servant, and that I have done all these things at your word. Answer me, O Lord, answer me, that this people may know that you, O Lord, are God, and that you have turned their hearts back." And the answer was instantaneous and overwhelming. Fire fell from heaven, not a lightning strike, but the very fire of the Lord. It consumed the burnt offering, the wood, the stones of the altar, and the dust. It licked up all the water in the trench. It was a complete and devastatingly powerful response. The people saw it, and they fell on their faces. The silence of their earlier indecision was broken by a single, thunderous cry of confession. "The Lord, He is God. The Lord, He is God." The contest was over. The prophets of Baal were seized and executed, purging the land of the leaders of the apostasy. And then Elijah turned to Ahab. "Go up, eat and drink," he said, "for there is a sound of the rushing of rain." Ahab went to celebrate, but Elijah went up to the top of Mount Carmel, bowed to the ground in prayer, and sent his servant to look out at the sea. 6 times the servant went and came back, saying, "There is nothing." But Elijah persisted in prayer. The 7th time, the servant returned with a report. "Behold, a little cloud like a man's hand is rising from the sea." It was a tiny sign, but it was enough. Elijah sent word to Ahab to hurry down the mountain before the storm stopped him. And in a short time, the sky grew black with clouds and wind, and a great downpour began. The drought was broken. The disaster that had been initiated by God's word through his prophet was now ended by God's mercy in response to his prophet's prayer. It was the final, irrefutable proof that the fate of Israel, the clouds and the rain, the life and the death of the land, was in the hands not of Baal, but of the living God of Israel. The fire that fell on Mount Carmel was a breathtaking moment of clarity. In that instant, with the smoke of the divine fire rising to the heavens, there was no doubt who was God in Israel. The people fell on their faces, the prophets of Baal were silenced, and the long drought was broken by a life-giving rain. It was a spectacular victory, but a single great victory, no matter how miraculous, rarely wins a war for the soul of a nation. The spiritual rot in the northern kingdom of Israel was too deep the allure of idolatry too entrenched. Queen Jezebel was not converted, she was enraged, and Elijah had to flee for his life. The story of Israel after Elijah is one of a slow, steady, and tragic decline. The memory of Carmel faded, and the people, as the prophet Hosea would later put it, went limping again after other gods. As the nations spiraled deeper into spiritual compromise, God raised up a new kind of messenger. They were not always performers of great public miracles like Elijah. They were poets, preachers, and social critics. Men commanded by God to speak His word into the heart of a decaying society, to hold up a mirror to the people and show them the true state of their hearts before it was too late. These are the writing prophets, and their words are a storm front of divine warning, gathering on the horizon of Israel's history. One of the first and most powerful of these voices was a man named Amos. He was not a polished court preacher or a member of the religious elite. He was a shepherd from Tekoa, a small town in the southern kingdom of Judah, and he was a dresser of sycamore fig trees. He was a working man, an outsider, and God sent this rugged, plain-spoken man north into the heart of the prosperous and complacent kingdom of Israel to deliver a message of searing judgment. Israel, in the time of Amos, was enjoying a period of peace and unprecedented economic prosperity. The rich were building lavish houses of ivory and hewn stone, lounging on beds of inlaid ivory, feasting on the finest lambs and calves, anointing themselves with the most expensive oils, and composing songs to the sound of the harp. Outwardly, it looked like God's blessing, but Amos had been given eyes to see the rot beneath the gilded surface. He saw that this prosperity was built on a foundation of injustice. The rich were getting richer by oppressing the poor, by trampling on the needy, by selling the righteous for silver and the needy for a pair of sandals. They were cheating in the marketplace, using dishonest scales to buy the poor for a pittance. The courts were corrupt. A bribe could buy any verdict. And all the while, they maintained a busy and elaborate religious life. They flocked to the religious centers of Bethel and Gilgal. They offered their burnt offerings and their grain offerings, their peace offerings of fatted animals. They sang their hymns and played their music. They thought they were pleasing God, and into this scene of self-satisfied religiosity, Amos delivers God's verdict, and it is utterly devastating. I despise your feasts, God says through the prophet, and I take no delight in your solemn assemblies. Even though you offer me your burnt offerings and grain offerings, I will not accept them. Take away from me the noise of your songs. To the melody of your harps, I will not listen. All of their religious activity, all the sights and sounds and smells they thought were pleasing to God, were nothing but an irritation to Him, because it was all a lie. It was a pious mask hiding a heartless reality. And then Amos delivers one of the most famous lines in all of prophetic literature, telling them what God truly wants. But let justice roll down like waters, and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. God didn't want more songs. He wanted fair trials. He didn't want more sacrifices. He wanted honest business practices. He didn't want religious festivals. He wanted compassion for the widow and the orphan. Because they had divorced their worship of God from their love for their neighbor, their entire religion had become an abomination. Amos warned them that a day of reckoning was coming, a day of the Lord that would be not light and victory, but darkness and doom, a day when a great and terrible nation from the north would come and carry them away from their land. While Amos diagnosed the social sickness of Israel, another prophet, Hosea, was called to diagnose its spiritual sickness. And God gave him the most painful and personal assignment imaginable. He was commanded to live out a parable of God's own heartbreak. "Go," God said to Hosea, "take to yourself a wife of whoredom, and have children of whoredom, for the land commits great whoredom by forsaking the Lord." And so Hosea married a woman named Gomer, and just as God had said, she was unfaithful to him. She left him to chase after other lovers, who she believed were the ones who gave her bread and water, wool and flax, oil and drink. This tragic marriage became a living sermon. Hosea's faithful, heartbroken love for his unfaithful wife was a picture of God's faithful, heartbroken love for his unfaithful people, Israel. Israel had come to believe that it was the Baals, the Canaanite fertility gods, who provided the rain and the grain and the new wine. They had forgotten that it was the Lord, their covenant God, who had given them everything. They were chasing after idols, committing spiritual adultery. Hosea's message is filled with the raw emotion of a betrayed husband. He speaks of God's anger, of his jealousy, of his judgment. But woven through it all is the thread of a relentless, stubborn love. In a stunning act of redemption, God tells Hosea to go and find his wife again. He finds her destitute, likely sold into slavery, and he has to buy her back. And he brings her home, not to punish her, but to woo her, to speak tenderly to her, and to renew their marriage vows. It is a staggering picture of the cost of God's grace, his willingness to pursue and redeem his people, even in the depths of their unfaithfulness. But the warnings of Amos and Hosea went unheeded. The northern kingdom of Israel continued in its idolatry and injustice, and the dark storm on the horizon that the prophets had foreseen began to gather. The mighty, ruthless empire of Assyria was on the rise, swallowing up the smaller nations around it. In 722 BC, the storm finally broke. The Assyrian army laid siege to Israel's capital city, Samaria. After 3 years, the city fell. The Assyrians, as was their policy, deported the Israelites, scattering them throughout their vast empire. The 10 northern tribes were, for all intents and purposes, lost to history. The disaster that Amos and Hosea had warned about had come to pass. A stark and terrifying object lesson for their sister kingdom to the south, Judah. One would think that the kingdom of Judah, with its capital in Jerusalem, the city of David, and the holy temple of Solomon on Mount Zion, would have learned from the fate of its northern cousin. They had a front row seat to the consequences of apostasy. But a strange spiritual arrogance had taken root in Judah. They believed they were special, They had the temple, the place where God's own glory was said to dwell. They had the Davidic king, the heir to God's everlasting covenant with David. They believed these things made them invincible, that God would never allow his own city and his own temple to be destroyed. This belief became a kind of spiritual good luck charm, a substitute for genuine faith and obedience. Into this world of false security, God sent some of his most powerful messengers. The prophet Isaiah, a man of noble birth who served in the royal court, was given a terrifying vision of God in the temple, seated on a throne, high and lifted up. Angelic beings, the seraphim, surrounded the throne, crying out, "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory." In the presence of such absolute holiness, Isaiah was undone. "Woe is me," he cried, "for I am a man of unclean lips, and I dwell in the midst of a people of unclean lips." Isaiah's message flowed from this vision. God is holy, and his people are not. Isaiah warned the kings of Judah not to put their trust in military might or in shifting political alliances with the great empires of Egypt and Assyria. "If you are not firm in faith," he warned the king, "you will not be firm at all." In a beautiful and tragic parable, he described Israel as a vineyard, carefully planted and tended by God. God looked for a harvest of good grapes, justice, and righteousness. But the vineyard yielded only wild grapes, bloodshed, and the sound of a cry. And so, the owner of the vineyard declared his intention. He would tear down its protective wall, remove its hedge, and let it be trampled and overgrown. It was a clear and devastating warning, but perhaps the most poignant and tragic voice of this era was the prophet Jeremiah. His ministry spanned the final 40 years of Judah's existence, a long, lonely, and heartbreaking career of speaking truth to a nation that had completely stopped its ears. God called him as a young man. Jeremiah protested, "Ah, Lord God, behold, I do not know how to speak, for I am only a youth." But God reassured him, "Do not say, 'I am only a youth,' for to all to whom I send you, you shall go. Do not be afraid of them, for I am with you to deliver you." God had set him over nations and kingdoms, to pluck up and to break down, to destroy and to overthrow, to build and to plant. For the next 4 decades, Jeremiah's life would be almost entirely composed of the first 4 of those actions, with very little of the last 2. One of his most famous and explosive prophecies was delivered at the very gate of the temple. As the crowds of worshipers were streaming in for a festival, Jeremiah stood there, a lone voice against the tide, and delivered God's message. Do not trust in these deceptive words. This is the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord. The people were using the building as an idol, a magical shield. Jeremiah told them it was a lie. He declared that God was not interested in their sacrifices, as long as they were stealing, murdering, committing adultery, and oppressing the widow, the orphan, and the foreigner. Their worship was a sham, turning God's house into a den of robbers. And then he delivered the knockout blow. He reminded them of what God had done to his previous sanctuary at Shiloh, which had been destroyed centuries earlier because of Israel's sin. And he warned them, "I will do to the house that is called by my name, and in which you trust, as I did to Shiloh." He was saying the unsayable. God was willing to destroy his own temple. The message was received as blasphemy and treason. The priests and the prophets seized him, shouting, "You shall die." He was only saved by the intervention of some of the city officials. Jeremiah's life became a series of living parables, dramatic public acts designed to wake the people from their spiritual slumber. He bought a linen waistband, a symbol of the priestly nation's closeness to God, wore it, and then buried it by the Euphrates River. When he dug it up later, it was marred and worthless, a picture of how Judah's pride and idolatry had ruined them. He was sent to a potter's house and watched the potter at his wheel. When a vessel was spoiled, the potter simply crushed the clay and reshaped it into a new pot. The message was clear. God was the potter, and Judah was the clay. He had the sovereign right to reshape or even to smash the nation if it did not serve its intended purpose. Later, he took a clay flask and in front of the city's leaders in the valley of Hinnom, a place where they had sacrificed their own children to the god Molech, he smashed the flask to pieces, declaring, "Thus says the Lord of hosts, so will I break this people and this city as one breaks a potter's vessel, so that it can never be mended." As the years went on and the people refused to listen, Jeremiah's message grew even darker. He began to tell them that the judgment was no longer avoidable. It was now fixed. The instrument of that judgment would be a new, rising superpower from the east, Babylon, led by its brilliant and ruthless king, Nebuchadnezzar, whom God himself called my servant. Repentance could no longer avert the disaster. The only path to survival, Jeremiah told them, was to submit to the yoke of Babylon. This message was profoundly unpopular. He was branded a traitor, a defeatist who was demoralizing the people. The false prophets, meanwhile, were preaching a message of peace and security, telling the people that God would never let Jerusalem fall, and that the Babylonian threat would soon disappear. Jeremiah was arrested, accused of deserting to the enemy, beaten, and thrown into a dungeon. Later, his enemies lowered him into a deep, muddy cistern, leaving him to sink into the mire and starve to death. He was rescued, but his life was one of relentless opposition and suffering. He became known as the weeping prophet, his heart breaking for the people he loved, who were marching stubbornly towards their own destruction. And the end came, just as he had said. In 597 BC, Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonian army laid siege to Jerusalem for the first time. The Judean king, Jehoiachin, surrendered. Nebuchadnezzar looted the temple treasures and deported the king, his court, and all the leading citizens, craftsmen, and soldiers, about 10,000 people in all, to Babylon. Among them was a young priest named Ezekiel, who would himself become a great prophet in exile. Nebuchadnezzar then installed the king's uncle, Zedekiah, on the throne as a puppet ruler. For about 9 years, there was a tense peace. But Zedekiah was a weak and vacillating king. He listened to the nationalistic, anti-Babylonian voices in his court and encouraged by the false prophets, he made a fatal decision. He rebelled against Nebuchadnezzar, breaking his sworn oath of vassalage. It was the final act of folly. In 588 BC, the Babylonian army returned, and this time there would be no mercy. They laid siege to Jerusalem again. The final siege lasted for nearly 2 years. The horrors of those months are vividly chronicled in the Book of Lamentations. The city was completely cut off. Food ran out. The vibrant city became a ghost town of starvation and disease. The descriptions are harrowing. Children begging for bread that wasn't there. The rich, who had once feasted, now scrounging for scraps on refuse heaps. Mothers, their hearts and minds broken by starvation, boiling and eating their own children. It was the complete and utter collapse of a civilization. Finally, in the summer of 586 BC, the Babylonians breached the Great Walls. The city was overrun. Zedekiah tried to flee in the night, but was captured on the plains of Jericho. He was taken before Nebuchadnezzar. There, he was forced to watch as his own sons were executed before his eyes. It was the last thing he would ever see. The Babylonians then blinded him, bound him in bronze chains, and led him away to die in a prison in Babylon. A month later, the Babylonian commander, Nebuzaradan, carried out the final destruction. The city was systematically looted and then put to the torch. The great palace was burned. The houses of the people were burned. The walls of Jerusalem were torn down. And most devastating of all, the great temple of Solomon, the magnificent structure that had been the center of Israel's faith for 400 years. The house where God's glory had once dwelled was burned to the ground. The people, all but the very poorest of the land, who were left to be vine dressers and plowmen, were rounded up and forced to march into exile in Babylon. The land was left desolate, quiet, and ruined. The covenant promises seemed to have ended in smoke and rubble. The ultimate national disaster had arrived. It was the darkest moment in the history of Old Testament Israel. It was more than a military and political defeat. It was a profound theological crisis. It looked as though God had been defeated, that the gods of Babylon were stronger. It looked as though the covenant was broken forever, the promises to Abraham and David null and void. But even here, in the ashes, the prophetic word did not fall silent. In fact, it had prepared them for this, framing even this ultimate catastrophe as a part of God's sovereign, if painful, plan. It was not a sign of God's weakness, but a sign of his awesome holiness, a terrible judgment on centuries of unfaithfulness. And remarkably, in the very midst of this collapse, the prophets began to speak of a future and a hope. Jeremiah, even as he predicted the destruction, also spoke of a day when God would make a new covenant with his people, not like the old one written on stone, which they had broken. This one, he said, would be written on their hearts. It would be a covenant of radical intimacy and complete forgiveness. I will forgive their iniquity, God promised through him, and I will remember their sin no more. It was a promise that judgment was not God's final word. And in the land of exile itself, among the deported citizens in Babylon, the prophet Ezekiel was given a vision that would become an anchor for their hope. God took him in a vision and set him down in the middle of a valley that was full of bones. They were very dry, very scattered, a picture of the nation of Israel, dead, hopeless, and dismembered. God asked him a question that hung in the air over the exiles. "Son of man, can these bones live?" Ezekiel could only answer, "O Lord God, you know." And God commanded him to prophesy to the bones. As he spoke, there was a rattling sound, and the bones began to come together, bone to its bone. Sinews and flesh came upon them, and skin covered them, but there was no breath in them. Then God commanded him to prophesy to the breath, to the spirit. And as he did, breath entered them, and they lived and stood on their feet, an exceedingly great army. The vision was a powerful, unforgettable promise. As dead and hopeless as Israel seemed, God had the power to resurrect his people. He would bring them back from the graveyard of their exile, put his own spirit in them, and plant them once more in their own land. And so, our long journey through the apocalyptic famines and disasters of the Old Testament ends here. It ends in the rubble of a destroyed city with a people in exile. It ends in a story of judgment so complete that it seemed to be the end of the story altogether. But the prophets, who had so accurately foretold the coming storm of judgment, also planted indestructible seeds of hope in the scorched earth. A hope for a new covenant, a new heart, and a new life. A hope that even the most final of disasters, death and exile itself, was no match for the restorative, resurrecting power of the God who had first called them into being.